The wooden gavel slammed down on the conference table with such force that my coffee cup rattled. And I knew right then that Susan Patterson, our HOA president, was about to make my life a living hell. I'm Oliver Matthews, a 42-year-old software engineer who moved to Maplewood Estates in Boulder, Colorado, 3 years ago because I fell in love with the mountain views and the promise of a quiet life. The subdivision sits right at the edge of town, where the foothills start their climb toward the Rockies. I'd saved for years to buy my 3-bedroom craftsman-style home, complete with a beautiful stone chimney that housed what I considered the crown jewel of my property. A brand new, EPA-certified wood stove. That February morning, I was standing in my kitchen making breakfast when I noticed Susan's silver Lexus pull into my driveway. She stepped out wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, her blonde bob perfectly styled despite the 7:30 hour. Behind her emerged 2 other members of the HOA board, Linda Chen, the treasurer, and Robert Whitmore, who always seemed to agree with whatever Susan said. I opened the door before she could knock, already sensing trouble. "Oliver, we need to talk about your chimney," Susan said without any greeting, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Good morning to you too, Susan. What about my chimney? Don't play dumb. The smoke. It's been billowing out of there for weeks now, and several residents have complained about the smell and the air quality." She crossed her arms, and I noticed she was holding a manila folder stuffed with papers. I leaned against the doorframe, genuinely confused. "My wood stove is EPA 2020 certified. It's one of the cleanest burning models on the market. I made sure of that before I installed it." "That may be," Robert chimed in, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "But the HOA bylaws are very clear about nuisance emissions, and we've received multiple complaints." Linda stayed quiet, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the confrontation. She'd always been the reasonable one on the board. "Multiple complaints? From who?" I asked. Susan opened her folder and pulled out a stack of printed emails. "I'm not at liberty to share names, but we have documentation of at least 7 households reporting smoke, particulate matter, and concerns about their family's health." I took the papers she thrust at me, skimming through them. The complaints were vague and almost identical in wording, which immediately raised my suspicions. Phrases like excessive smoke pollution and health hazards from wood burning appeared in nearly every one. "This is ridiculous," I said, handing them back. "I burn seasoned hardwood, and the stove has a catalytic converter. There's barely any visible smoke most of the time." "Be that as it may," Susan continued, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate during board meetings. "We're implementing a new bylaw specifically addressing wood-burning appliances. You'll need to either disconnect your stove or install scrubbers that meet our standards." She handed me another document, this one looking freshly printed. I scanned the proposed bylaw. It was absurd. The emission standards they were proposing were stricter than EPA requirements and would essentially make it impossible to operate any wood-burning appliance in the neighborhood. "You can't just make up bylaws overnight," I protested. "There's a process. This needs to go to a vote." "We're voting on it at the emergency board meeting tonight," Susan said with a satisfied expression. "As a courtesy, we wanted to inform you beforehand since you're the primary party affected." Emergency board meeting. This isn't an emergency. This is you overstepping your authority. Robert cleared his throat. "The board has the right to call emergency meetings when community health and safety are concerned. It's in Section 12 of the CC and Articles." "My wood stove isn't a health and safety issue," I said, my frustration growing. "You want to talk about emissions. Half the houses in this neighborhood have gas furnaces that put out carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides. Linda, doesn't your house have a gas furnace? Linda nodded slightly, still looking uncomfortable. It does, but that's different, Oliver. Gas is cleaner than wood. Actually, that's not necessarily true, I countered. Modern wood stoves can be incredibly clean, much cleaner than people think. Susan held up her hand. Regardless of your opinions on the matter, the meeting is tonight at 7 in the community center. I suggest you attend if you want to voice your concerns. But I'll be honest with you, Oliver. The board has already discussed this extensively, and we believe this bylaw is in the best interest of the community. They left, and I stood in my doorway watching them drive away, my breakfast forgotten and my blood pressure rising. I'd dealt with Susan's power trips before. 6 months ago, she tried to fine me because my lawn was allegedly a quarter-inch too long. Before that, she'd sent me a violation notice because I'd left my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. But this was different. This was a direct attack on something I'd invested significant money in, something that heated my home and saved me hundreds on energy bills each month. I spent the rest of the day doing research. I pulled up the specifications for my wood stove, a premium model from a company called Clean Burn Technologies. The emissions data was impressive. The stove produced less than 2 grams of particulate matter per hour, well below the EPA's limit of 2.5 grams. I found studies comparing wood stove emissions to natural gas furnaces, and discovered what I'd suspected. Properly operated modern wood stoves could indeed be cleaner than many gas heating systems, especially older ones. The emergency meeting that night was held in the Maplewood Estates Community Center, a building that looked more like a luxury clubhouse with its vaulted ceilings and stone fireplace. The irony of having a decorative fireplace in a building where they were about to ban functional ones wasn't lost on me. About 30 residents showed up, which was actually a decent turnout for our subdivision of 80 homes. I recognized most of the faces. There was Margaret Sullivan, the elderly woman from 3 houses down who always complimented my garden. The Hendersons, a young couple with 2 kids. Tom Bradley, a retired firefighter who'd helped me move furniture when I first arrived. Susan called the meeting to order with her usual self-importance, going through standard procedural items before getting to the main event. As you all know, she began, we've gathered tonight to address a serious environmental and health concern affecting our community. One of our residents has been operating a wood-burning stove that's producing significant pollution and affecting the air quality in our neighborhood. Several heads turned toward me. I felt my jaw clench. The board has drafted a new bylaw that will regulate wood-burning appliances to ensure they meet strict emission standards that protect our community's health and property values. Susan clicked her remote, and a PowerPoint presentation appeared on the screen at the front of the room. For the next 20 minutes, she presented a slideshow that looked like it had been pulled from an anti-pollution website. There were pictures of old, smoking chimneys belching black clouds, charts showing health effects of particulate matter, statistics about wood smoke causing respiratory problems. None of it was specific to my stove or my situation. It was all generic scare tactics. When she finally finished, she asked if anyone had questions or comments. I raised my hand immediately. Yes, Oliver. Susan said, her tone suggesting she'd expected this. I stood up, holding my folder of research. Everything you just showed us is about old, uncertified wood stoves or improperly operated ones. My stove is EPA 2020 certified, which means it's held to the strictest standards for wood-burning appliances in the United States. The emissions are minimal and well within legal limits. Your opinion of what's minimal doesn't match the complaints we've received, Susan shot back. Then maybe those complaints are exaggerated or based on misconceptions. Have any of you actually measured the emissions from my chimney? Do you have any actual data showing my stove is causing a problem? Robert stood up. We don't need to measure anything. The visible smoke and the smell are evidence enough. Visible smoke from a properly burning wood fire should be minimal, I said. And the smell? Wood smoke smells like wood smoke. That's not pollution, that's just an odor some people might not prefer. Margaret Sullivan raised her hand tentatively. I live close to Oliver and I haven't noticed any smoke problems. Sometimes I smell the wood burning, but it's actually kind of nice. Reminds me of camping. Susan's expression tightened. Thank you, Margaret, but the board has received multiple complaints and we have a responsibility to act on them. Can you tell us who complained? I asked. I think we have a right to know who's accusing me of polluting the neighborhood. The complaints were submitted confidentially, and we'll respect that privacy, Susan said firmly. Tom Bradley, the retired firefighter, spoke up. Susan, I've dealt with a lot of fires and smoke in my career. If Oliver's got a modern EPA stove and he's burning it properly, there shouldn't be a significant problem. Maybe we should get an actual assessment done before we start banning things. This bylaw doesn't ban wood stoves, Linda clarified, speaking up for the first time. It just sets standards they need to meet. Standards that are impossible to meet, I said. I reviewed the proposed bylaw. You're requiring emission levels lower than EPA standards, which means even the cleanest wood stove on the market wouldn't qualify. That's effectively a ban. The meeting devolved into arguments. Some residents supported Susan, mostly people who lived on the other side of the subdivision and probably had no idea what my chimney even looked like. Others, particularly my closer neighbors, seemed confused about what the actual problem was. After an hour of debate, Susan called for the board vote. She, Robert, and two other board members I hadn't seen much involvement from voted yes. Linda abstained, which surprised me and seemed to irritate Susan. The bylaw passed 4-0 with one abstention. The new regulation will take effect in 30 days, Susan announced. That gives affected parties time to come into compliance or cease operation of non-compliant wood-burning appliances. I left the meeting furious. 30 days to comply with impossible standards or stop using the heating system I'd spent thousands of dollars installing. It was absurd and clearly targeted specifically at me. The next morning, I called my lawyer, a guy named James who'd helped me with my house purchase. After explaining the situation, he listened quietly before giving me his assessment. HOAs have broad authority to regulate properties within their jurisdiction, James said, but they can't be arbitrary or discriminatory. If you can prove this bylaw was created specifically to target you, or if you can show that your wood stove actually meets reasonable emission standards, you might have a case. What about getting an actual emissions test done? I asked. Proving that my stove is cleaner than they're claiming. That could work. If you can demonstrate that your emissions are within EPA guidelines and that the HOA's standards are unreasonably strict, a judge might find the bylaw invalid. But testing isn't cheap, and there's no guarantee it would change the board's mind. I spent the next few days researching emissions testing companies. Most of them did industrial testing or vehicle emissions. But I finally found a company called Environmental Air Quality Solutions based in Denver that did residential testing and had EPA certification for wood stove evaluations. I called them and spoke with a technician named Dave Richards. After explaining my situation, He told me they could do a comprehensive emissions test on my wood stove that would measure particulate matter, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and other pollutants. The cost was $2,000. It was a lot of money, but I was angry enough and stubborn enough to pay it. We scheduled the test for the following week. In the meantime, I started noticing something strange. Every evening around 6, when I'd typically light my wood stove, Susan's silver Lexus would drive slowly past my house. The first time, I thought it was coincidence. The second and third times, I realized she was monitoring me. On the fourth evening, I decided to conduct my own investigation. Instead of lighting my stove, I watched out my window. Sure enough, at 6:15, Susan's car appeared. She drove past slowly, looking at my chimney. When no smoke appeared, she circled the block and drove by again. 20 minutes later, I grabbed my phone and started recording. Over the next hour, she made 4 passes by my house. On the last one, I walked out onto my porch. "Can I help you with something, Susan?" She stopped her car and rolled down the window. "Just taking an evening drive. Passed my house 4 times in an hour. I live in this neighborhood. I can drive wherever I want." "This is harassment," I said. "You're monitoring my property." "I'm ensuring compliance with community standards," she replied coldly. "If you're not burning that stove, you're already halfway to compliance." She drove off before I could respond. The emissions test was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Dave Richards arrived with a van full of equipment around 9 in the morning. He was a stocky guy in his 50s with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that I appreciated. "So walk me through your operation," Dave said as we stood in my living room looking at the wood stove. "What kind of wood do you burn? How do you light it? How do you maintain it?" I explained my process. "I burned primarily oak and maple that I bought from a local supplier who guaranteed it was seasoned for at least 18 months. I used a bottom-up fire-starting method that minimized smoke during ignition. I had the chimney cleaned twice a year and maintained the catalytic converter according to manufacturer specifications." Dave nodded approvingly. "You're doing everything right. Let's see what the numbers say." The testing process took most of the day. Dave set up monitors both inside and outside my house. He installed sensors in the chimney to measure flue gas composition. He even set up air quality monitors at various points around my property and asked permission to place one in my neighbor Margaret's yard, which she happily granted. We ran the stove through multiple cycles: cold start, steady burn, reload, and damper adjustments. Dave measured everything: particulate matter, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, and several other emissions I'd never heard of. Around 2 in the afternoon, Susan's car appeared. She parked across the street and got out, walking toward my property. "What's going on here?" she demanded, looking at the equipment. "EPA-certified emissions testing," I said. "I'm getting actual data on what my wood stove produces. You don't have permission to conduct commercial operations in a residential zone," she said. Dave looked up from his laptop. "Madam, this isn't a commercial operation. This is environmental testing on private property with the owner's permission. We have all the necessary certifications and permits." Susan's face reddened. "The HOA board should have been notified." "Why?" I asked. "I don't need HOA permission to test my own heating system." She stood there for a moment, clearly trying to think of some regulation I was violating. Finding none, she got back in her car and left, but not before taking several photos of Dave's van and equipment. By 5 that evening, Dave started packing up his equipment. "I'll have the full report ready in about a week," he said. "But I can tell you right now, your stove is performing exceptionally well. Preliminary numbers show you're well below EPA limits for all measured pollutants. How well below? I asked. Particulate matter is averaging around 1.2 grams per hour. EPA limit is 2.5. Carbon monoxide is minimal. Nitrogen oxides are barely detectable. Honestly, this is one of the cleanest wood stove operations I've tested. I felt vindicated but also more frustrated. So the HOA is creating regulations to ban something that's already cleaner than their legal limits. Dave shrugged. HOAs do what they want, but you'll have the data to fight back. I'll also include comparative data in my report. Comparative data. Yeah, we'll compare your wood stove emissions to typical residential heating systems. Natural gas furnaces, propane, even heat pumps when you account for power plant emissions. It'll give you perspective on where your system sits in the bigger picture. That perked up my interest. How does wood compare? Depends on the system, Dave said. Old wood stoves are terrible, some of the worst for particulate pollution, but modern EPA stoves like yours, they're surprisingly clean, often cleaner than people expect. I've tested gas furnaces that put out more nitrogen oxides than your wood stove puts out in total pollutants. This gave me an idea. Dave, is there any way to test emissions from other houses in my neighborhood, specifically gas furnaces? He thought about it. We could do external air quality monitoring. Set up sensors at various points in the neighborhood and measure ambient pollutant levels. We could identify sources based on location and chemical signatures. But that's expensive, probably another $3,000 or $4,000, and you'd need to do it over several days to get meaningful data. I considered it. I was already in for $2,000. What was another $4,000? Do it, I said. I want to know exactly what's in the air in this neighborhood. Dave looked surprised but nodded. All right. I'll need to set up a monitoring grid, probably 6 to 8 sensors around the subdivision. We'll run them for 5 days, collect data on heating system emissions, vehicle emissions, everything. You'll have a complete picture of air quality in Maplewood Estates. Perfect. When can you start? I can set it up tomorrow and run the monitoring through the weekend into next week. We shook hands and he left. I felt like I was finally taking control of the situation, instead of just reacting to Susan's accusations. The next day, Dave returned with several compact air quality monitors. He placed them strategically around the neighborhood, disguising them as electrical boxes or mounting them on utility poles. He'd obtained the necessary permissions from the utility companies and had permits from the county for environmental monitoring. Susan noticed, of course. By evening, my phone was ringing. "What are those monitoring devices around the neighborhood?" she demanded without preamble. "Air quality monitors," I said. "Since you're so concerned about emissions, I thought we should get actual data on what everyone's contributing to the local air quality. You can't just install equipment around the neighborhood without HOA approval. They're not on HOA property. They're on utility poles and public easements, and the monitoring company has all the proper permits from the county." "This is invasive and unnecessary," Susan said, her voice rising. "You're wasting money on a problem that's obvious to anyone with eyes. If it's so obvious, the data will confirm it," I replied. "But I suspect the data is going to tell a very different story." She hung up on me. Over the next week, while the monitors collected data, I received 2 more violation notices from the HOA. The first claimed my outdoor trash bins were visible from the street for more than the allowed time. I had a photo showing they'd been put away within an hour of pickup. The second claimed my house number wasn't properly illuminated at night, which was absurd since I had a perfectly functional light above my address numbers. It was clear harassment, and I documented everything. Dave called me the following Thursday. Reports ready. You want me to email it, or do you want to meet in person? In person, I said immediately. Can you come by tomorrow? Friday morning, Dave arrived with 2 thick binders and a laptop. We sat at my kitchen table, and he opened the first binder. Let's start with your wood stove, he said, flipping to a page filled with charts and numbers. As I mentioned, you're well within EPA guidelines. Particulate matter averaged 1.2 grams per hour across all burn cycles. That's 52% below the EPA limit. Carbon monoxide was minimal, averaging 18 parts per million at the cleanest part of the burn cycle. Nitrogen oxides were nearly undetectable. Volatile organic compounds were also well within acceptable ranges. He showed me the charts, which had green highlighted sections showing EPA limits and blue bars showing my actual emissions. Every bar was comfortably in the green. Now, here's where it gets interesting, Dave continued, opening the second binder. The neighborhood-wide air quality monitoring. He spread out a map of Maplewood Estates with the monitoring locations marked. Colored zones showed concentration levels of various pollutants. What we found is that your wood stove, even when operating, contributes very little to the ambient air quality. The monitors closest to your house showed slight elevation in particulate matter during burn times, but nothing approaching unhealthy levels. What about the gas furnaces? I asked. Dave flipped to another page. That's the interesting part. We detected significantly higher nitrogen oxide levels throughout the neighborhood, particularly during morning hours when furnaces are running to warm up houses. We also found elevated carbon monoxide levels near several properties. He pointed to specific areas on the map. These 3 houses here showed the highest nitrogen oxide emissions. Based on the chemical signature and timing, they're almost certainly from gas furnaces. This house here had a carbon monoxide reading that's actually concerning. The furnace might not be venting properly. I leaned forward, studying the map. One of the houses was Robert Whitmore's, a board member who'd voted for the wood stove ban. Another was Karen Delaney's, a resident who'd been vocal at the meeting about smoke complaints. So you're telling me the gas furnaces in this neighborhood are producing more harmful emissions than my wood stove? In terms of nitrogen oxides and carbon monoxide, yes, absolutely, Dave said. Now, wood stoves do produce more particulate matter than gas furnaces, even clean ones like yours. But your particulate emissions are so low and so localized that they're not creating any meaningful air quality problem. Meanwhile, these gas furnaces are producing nitrogen oxides at levels that, while still within legal limits, are significantly higher than your total emissions profile. He pulled out another chart. Here's a direct comparison. I estimated annual emissions based on typical usage patterns. Your wood stove, if you burn it 6 hours a day for 5 months, produces approximately X amount of total pollutants. A standard gas furnace running for the same heating season produces Y amount. When you account for nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide, many of these gas furnaces have a larger emissions footprint than your wood stove. I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. Can you put this in language a judge would understand? Or an HOA board? Already done, Dave said, handing me a summary report. This is the executive summary with all the key findings, comparisons, and conclusions. It's written in plain English with the technical data in appendices for anyone who wants to dig deeper. I spent the weekend reading through every page of the reports. The data was damning for the HOA's case. Not only was my wood stove cleaner than they'd claimed, but the neighborhood-wide monitoring showed that gas furnaces were producing significantly more harmful emissions. On Monday, I sent a formal letter to the HOA board. I included copies of the emissions reports and a clear message. The proposed bylaw was based on false assumptions about wood stove emissions. My stove was demonstrably clean and legal, and I would not be complying with regulations that were more restrictive than EPA standards without scientific justification. I also suggested, somewhat pointedly, that if the board was truly concerned about air quality, they should consider regulating gas furnace maintenance and efficiency instead of targeting EPA-certified wood stoves. Susan's response came by certified mail 2 days later. The HOA was fining me $500 for continued operation of a non-compliant heating system and threatened daily fines of $100 until I came into compliance. That's when I called James, my lawyer, back. They're fining you before the 30-day compliance period is even up. James asked, sounding genuinely surprised. Apparently, the letter says I was supposed to stop using the stove immediately upon bylaw passage. That's not what bylaws typically specify. Usually there's a grace period. Do you have documentation of what was actually passed? I realized I didn't. They never sent me the final version of the bylaw, just the proposed one at the meeting. That's a problem for them, James said. You can't enforce a bylaw that hasn't been properly distributed to residents. Also, with this emissions data you have, I think we have a strong case. Let me file an injunction to stop the fines and challenge the bylaw. This might actually go to court. Good, I said. I want it to go to court. I want this on record. James filed the paperwork that week. The injunction request was granted by a Boulder County judge, temporarily halting any fines while the case proceeded. The judge also ordered the HOA to provide documentation of the bylaw passage, including meeting minutes and the final bylaw language. Susan was livid. She showed up at my door 3 days after the injunction was granted, accompanied by Robert. "You're tearing this community apart," she said, her face flushed with anger. "All because you refuse to be a good neighbor and stop polluting our air." "I'm not polluting anything," I replied calmly. "I have scientific data proving that. Your so-called data is from a company you paid. Of course they're going to tell you what you want to hear. Dave Richards is EPA certified and has no reason to falsify data. His reputation depends on accuracy. But if you don't trust his findings, hire your own testing company. I'll cooperate fully." Robert adjusted his glasses nervously. "Susan, maybe we should consider that option. If we get our own testing done and it shows the same results, we could strengthen our case." Susan shot him a look that could freeze water. "We're not spending HOA money to prove what we already know. The complaints speak for themselves." "The complaints are anonymous and unsubstantiated," I said. "Show me actual evidence of harm and I'll address it." "But you can't just make up regulations because you don't like wood smoke. I'm the HOA president, and this board has the authority to protect property values and community standards," Susan said, her voice getting louder. "Your smokestacks are an eyesore, your chimney is ugly, and you're destroying the character of this neighborhood with your backwoods heating methods." There it was. The real reason. It wasn't about emissions or health or air quality. Susan thought wood stoves were beneath the standards of Maplewood Estates. This was about aesthetics and her personal preferences. "So this was never about emissions," I said quietly. "You just don't like how it looks." "It's about maintaining property values," Susan insisted. "Houses with wood smoke hanging over them don't sell as well." "There is no wood smoke hanging over anything," I said. "But even if there was, you can't ban something because you think it looks tacky. There are legal standards for habitability and emissions, and I meet all of them." She turned to leave, then stopped. You've made an enemy of this board, Oliver. We have ways of making life difficult for non-compliant homeowners. Is that a threat? I asked. It's a reality, she said and walked away. After they left, I immediately called James and recounted the conversation, as much as I could remember word for word. That's useful, James said. It shows discriminatory intent. They're not actually concerned about emissions. They're targeting your wood stove because they don't like it aesthetically. That's not a valid basis for regulation. The HOA's response to the court order arrived a week later. They provided meeting minutes that I immediately noticed had been altered. The date stamps didn't match my calendar, and several sections of discussion that I clearly remembered were missing or summarized differently. Most importantly, the final bylaw they submitted to the court was different from the proposed bylaw they'd shown at the meeting. The compliance timeline had been changed, and some language about exemptions had been removed. James caught it immediately. This is either incompetence or fraud. Either they're submitting inaccurate documents to the court, or they're trying to retroactively change what was passed. I checked my phone. I'd recorded parts of the meeting, specifically the bylaw reading. The audio clearly contradicted what the HOA had submitted to the court. I have a recording, I told James. There was silence on the other end. Then, you recorded the HOA meeting. Yes, is that a problem? In Colorado, you only need one-party consent for recording. Since you were present, the recording is legal. This is excellent. Send it to me immediately. I emailed the audio file, and James filed an amendment to our case, pointing out the discrepancies between the recorded bylaw and the submitted documents, along with the audio evidence. The judge was not pleased. At the hearing 2 weeks later, I sat in the Boulder County Courthouse watching as Judge Patricia Morrison reviewed the evidence. Susan, Robert, and Linda sat at the defendant's table with the HOA's lawyer, a nervous-looking young man who clearly hadn't expected this level of complication. Judge Morrison looked over her glasses at the HOA's attorney. "Counselor, can you explain why the bylaws submitted to this court differ from the bylaws recorded at the public meeting?" the attorney stammered. "Your Honor, there may have been some clerical errors in transcription." Clerical errors. The judge held up a document. These aren't typos. These are substantive changes to compliance timelines and enforcement provisions. This appears to be either negligence or an attempt to modify bylaws after passage to strengthen your case. Susan leaned forward and whispered urgently to her attorney. He nodded and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the board did make some clarifying amendments after the meeting to ensure the bylaw was properly enforceable." "And were these amendments voted on at a public meeting?" the judge asked. "Well, no, Your Honor. They were administrative clarifications." Judge Morrison's expression hardened. "Bylaws can't be administratively clarified after passage. That's not how homeowner associations work. Any changes require a proper vote at a noticed meeting." She set down the documents. "Beyond the procedural problems, I've reviewed the emissions testing data submitted by Mr. Matthews. His wood stove appears to be well within EPA guidelines and produces emissions comparable to or lower than many other heating systems in terms of total pollutant load. The HOA's proposed regulations are significantly more restrictive than federal standards without scientific justification for why that's necessary." The HOA's attorney tried to respond. "Your Honor, HOAs have broad authority to regulate properties within their boundaries." "They do," the judge agreed, "but that authority isn't unlimited. Regulations must be reasonable, uniformly applied, and serve a legitimate purpose. This appears to be a targeted regulation against one homeowner based on aesthetic preferences rather than genuine health or safety concerns." She made her ruling from the bench. The injunction against fines was made permanent. The wood stove bylaw was invalidated due to procedural defects and unreasonable restrictions. The HOA was ordered to pay my legal fees and was warned that any further harassment would result in sanctions. I wanted to feel triumphant, but Susan's expression as we left the courtroom told me this wasn't over. I was right. 2 weeks after the court ruling, I received a notice from the county building department. An anonymous complaint had been filed claiming my wood stove installation wasn't properly permitted. I pulled my files. The stove had been installed by a licensed contractor 3 years ago, and I had all the permits and inspection records. I sent copies to the county, and the complaint was dismissed within days. Then I got a notice from my insurance company. They'd received information suggesting I had an unpermitted heating system and wanted to inspect my property or risk cancellation of coverage. Again, I provided documentation and the issue was resolved. Next came a visit from the fire marshal. Another anonymous complaint, this time about improper chimney clearances and fire hazards. The fire marshal inspected my installation, found everything up to code and left. But he mentioned, almost casually, that he'd received similar complaints about my property 3 times in the past month, all anonymous. "Someone's really got it out for you," he said as he packed up his inspection equipment. "Your installation is perfect, better than most I see. Whoever's complaining either has bad information or bad intentions." It was harassment, plain and simple, and it was coming from the HOA. I started documenting everything, every complaint, every inspection, every interaction. Then things escalated. I came home from work one evening in early April to find my mailbox knocked over. The post was broken, and my mail was scattered across the lawn. I initially thought it was teenage vandalism, but the break looked deliberate, like someone had hit it with something heavy. I filed a police report and installed a security camera. 3 days later, the camera caught Susan's silver Lexus driving slowly past my house at 2 in the morning. It didn't stop, but the timing was strange enough that I flagged the footage. A week after that, someone spray-painted polluter across my driveway at night. My security camera caught 2 figures in hoodies, but the footage wasn't clear enough to identify them. The police took a report but said without identifiable suspects, there wasn't much they could do. I was sitting in my living room that evening, staring at my graffitied driveway through the window when my phone rang. It was Margaret, my elderly neighbor. "Oliver, I think you should know something," she said quietly. "I saw Susan and Robert at the community center yesterday." They were talking loudly enough that I could hear them while I was walking past. Susan was saying something about making you regret fighting the board, that you needed to learn your place. Did she say anything specific? Not that I heard clearly, but Oliver, I'm worried. Susan's always been controlling, but this feels different, more personal, more angry. "Thanks for telling me, Margaret. I'm documenting everything." "Be careful," she said before hanging up. That weekend, I was out working in my yard when Karen Delaney, one of the residents who'd complained at the meeting, approached me. She looked uncomfortable. "Oliver, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure," I said, setting down my rake. "I wanted to apologize. Susan came to me before that meeting and told me your wood stove was creating a health hazard. She said you were burning trash and creating toxic smoke. She asked me to file a complaint with the HOA, and I did without really thinking about it." I nodded slowly. "Did she tell other people the same thing?" "I think so. I talked to Linda from the board, and she mentioned that Susan had organized a calling campaign to generate complaints. She told people your stove was dangerous and illegal." "It's neither of those things," I said. "I know that now." After the court case, I looked into it more. I felt stupid for believing her without checking. I'm sorry. I appreciate that, I said. Would you be willing to put that in writing? That Susan solicited your complaint. Karen hesitated but then nodded. Yes. I don't like being manipulated, and I don't like what she's doing to you now. She sent me an email that afternoon detailing Susan's campaign to generate complaints. It was evidence of premeditation and targeted harassment. I forwarded it to James, who immediately saw its value. This is showing a pattern. The fabricated complaints, the anonymous reports to agencies, the vandalism. We might have grounds for a harassment lawsuit or even a restraining order. I just want this to stop, I said. I want to heat my house and be left alone. I understand, but you need to protect yourself legally. Let me send a cease and desist letter to Susan and the board. It'll formalize that their behavior constitutes harassment and put them on notice. The cease and desist letter was delivered 3 days later. Susan's response was to file a countersuit claiming I was defaming the HOA board and creating a hostile environment in the neighborhood. It was absurd, but it required a legal response, which meant more time and more money spent on lawyers. The situation reached its breaking point in late April. I woke up one morning to find my chimney cap missing. The stainless steel cap, which prevented rain and animals from entering the chimney, had been removed. The security camera showed 2 people on my roof at 3 in the morning, but again, the footage wasn't clear enough for positive identification. I called the police, filed another report, and replaced the chimney cap. But this time, the police took more interest. The responding officer, a sergeant named Mike Thompson, reviewed all my previous reports and the security footage. This is escalating, he said. Whoever's doing this is getting bolder. Being on your roof is serious trespassing, and tampering with heating systems could be considered reckless endangerment if they did anything that could cause carbon monoxide issues. I think it's related to the HOA dispute, I told him, explaining the full situation. Sergeant Thompson took extensive notes. I'm going to talk to the HOA president and board members. Sometimes when people realize they're under police scrutiny, they back off. 2 days later, I got a call from Sergeant Thompson. I interviewed Susan Patterson. She denied any involvement in the vandalism or harassment, but got extremely defensive when I brought it up. She also made some statements that concerned me. What kind of statements? She said you were a problem resident who refused to follow community standards, and that the neighborhood would be better off if you left. She said the HOA had ways of making non-compliant homeowners uncomfortable enough to sell. I informed her that vandalism and harassment are crimes regardless of HOA disputes, and that the department would be monitoring the situation. How did she respond? She threatened to file a complaint against me for harassment. Then her lawyer called my captain an hour later. He paused. Mr. Matthews, I've been doing this job for 18 years. In my experience, when people lawyer up that fast and get that defensive, they're usually hiding something. Watch your back. I upgraded my security system, adding more cameras with better night vision and motion-activated lights. I documented everything, backed up all footage to cloud storage, and kept a detailed log of every incident. For about 2 weeks, things were quiet. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early May, everything came to a head. I was inside making dinner when my security system alert went off. Multiple cameras detected motion around my house. I pulled up the feed on my phone and saw 3 people in my backyard. They were doing something near my chimney. I called 911 immediately. There are people trespassing on my property, and they're tampering with my heating system. The dispatcher kept me on the line while officers were dispatched. I watched through the camera as the 3 figures worked quickly. One of them was definitely female, with a build and movement pattern that looked like Susan. Another was taller and thinner, possibly Robert. Police arrived within 6 minutes, fast enough that the trespassers were still on my property. I heard shouting from the backyard and rushed to my back door. 2 police officers had 3 people in handcuffs. Under the motion lights, I could clearly see Susan, Robert, and a third person I didn't recognize, a younger man in dark clothing. Sergeant Thompson arrived a few minutes later. He spoke with the officers, then approached me. "Mr. Matthews, are you willing to press charges for trespassing and vandalism?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "And do you know what they were doing back here?" I walked with him to the chimney. Someone had stuffed rags into the chimney flue opening and had been in the process of sealing it with some kind of expanding foam. Sergeant Thompson's expression turned grim. "They were blocking your chimney. If you'd run your wood stove with the flue blocked, carbon monoxide and smoke would have backed up into your house. This isn't just vandalism. This is reckless endangerment, potentially attempted assault." My blood ran cold. They weren't just harassing me anymore. They were trying to create a dangerous, potentially deadly situation. The 3 were arrested on the spot. As Susan was being led to a patrol car, she was shouting about property values and community standards, completely unhinged. Robert was silent, looking shocked at what they'd been caught doing. Over the next few days, the full story emerged. The third person was Susan's adult son, Michael, who'd been helping with the harassment campaign. The police investigation revealed that Susan had been obsessed with forcing me out of the neighborhood. They found text messages between her and Robert discussing ways to make my life difficult, including the anonymous complaints and the vandalism. Most disturbingly, they found that Susan had researched carbon monoxide poisoning and knew exactly what blocking a chimney would do. The prosecution argued this showed premeditation and intent to cause serious harm. The HOA held an emergency meeting and removed Susan from the board. Robert resigned. Linda, who'd known nothing about the harassment campaign, became interim president. One of her first actions was to formally apologize to me on behalf of the HOA and to rescind all previous violation notices and fines. The board voted to never again propose regulations more restrictive than EPA standards without scientific justification. Susan, Robert, and Michael were charged with multiple crimes: trespassing, vandalism, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to commit assault. Susan's lawyer tried to argue she'd just been trying to protect the community, but the evidence of her targeted campaign, the false complaints, and the deliberate chimney blocking was overwhelming. In September, Susan and Robert took plea deals. Susan pled guilty to reckless endangerment and conspiracy, receiving 2 years of probation, community service, and a permanent restraining order keeping her away from my property. She was also required to pay restitution for all my legal fees and damages. Robert received 1 year of probation. Michael, who apparently hadn't known about the chimney plan and thought they were just going to spray paint my house again, received a lesser charge of criminal trespassing. The case made local news. Several articles covered the HOA dispute that escalated to criminal charges, and I got calls from reporters asking for interviews. I declined most of them, wanting to just put the whole situation behind me. In October, I received an interesting phone call. It was from a county commissioner named Jennifer Grant, whose name I'd seen on campaign signs around Boulder. "Mr. Matthews, I've been following your case. It's highlighted some issues with HOA oversight that concern me. Would you be willing to testify before the county commission about HOA regulation?" I agreed. And the following month, I spoke at a county commission hearing about the need for better oversight of HOA boards and clearer standards for what regulations they could impose. My testimony, along with the emissions data Dave had collected, contributed to a new county ordinance requiring HOAs to provide scientific justification for any regulations more restrictive than state or federal standards. It was a small victory, but it meant something. By December, life had finally returned to normal. I burned my wood stove throughout the winter without interference. My neighbors, most of whom had been quietly supportive throughout the ordeal, were friendlier than ever. Margaret brought me cookies. Tom Bradley invited me to a Christmas party. Even Karen Delaney, who'd apologized for filing the false complaint, made a point of telling me how much she actually enjoyed the smell of wood smoke on cold evenings. The new HOA board, led by Linda, focused on actual community improvements rather than harassment campaigns. They organized neighborhood events, addressed real maintenance issues, and generally operated the way an HOA should. On a cold evening in January, almost a year after Susan had first knocked on my door with her complaints, I sat in my living room with a fire burning cleanly in my wood stove. The flames danced behind the glass door, and I could hear the soft crackle of seasoned oak burning efficiently, producing minimal smoke and keeping my house warm. I'd spent over $10,000 on testing, lawyers, and security systems. I'd endured months of harassment and stress. I'd had my property vandalized and my safety threatened. But I'd won. Not just the legal case, but something more important. I'd stood up to unreasonable authority, demanded accountability, and proven that science and facts matter more than someone's personal vendetta. My wood stove was cleaner than most heating systems in the neighborhood. The EPA test had proved it. The court had recognized it, and the community had ultimately accepted it. I thought about Susan sometimes, wondering if she'd learned anything from the experience. Probably not. People like her rarely saw their own faults, but at least she couldn't hurt anyone else in Maplewood Estates. The wood stove crackled, the fire burned clean, and outside my window, a light snow began to fall over the Colorado foothills. I was home, I was warm, and I was finally at peace. The subdivision was quiet now, the way it should have been all along. Lights glowed in windows up and down the street, families going about their evening routines. Some had gas furnaces humming away. A few had heat pumps running. And I had my wood stove, burning cleanly and efficiently, exactly as designed. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing up for what was right, demanding evidence instead of accepting accusations, and refusing to be bullied by people who abused their authority. I'd moved to Maplewood Estates for the mountain views and the promise of a quiet life. It had taken a year of fighting, but I finally had both. The fire burned on, clean and bright, warming my home through another Colorado winter night.